I'm actually going to begin by asking Mark to speak a little bit to what you call the 4 unconscious themes. You can read about this in his book, but I think it's really important to what we've both been speaking about today and to maybe take us a few layers deeper.
Before I begin to work with somebody, I'm looking for how the life force is occluded. Somehow it makes sense to me that there are 4, there's probably a million ways life force is occluded, but there's 4 ways that life force can be limited that have an unconscious effect on us. In other words, I'll just name them. We've merged with the life experience of a parent and don't realize that this is occurring. Our father fails and we fail. Our mother gives away a child or loses a child. We abort our first child. Our parents begin to break up in their 30s, and then in our 30s, we start to pull away from our partner. The first theme, we've merged with the experience, a behavior, a situation, and unconsciously we can't see how it's replaying itself in us. That's one. The second, we reject a parent. Well, we know we reject a parent, that's not unconscious, but the effects in us are often unconscious. We disown the behavior in us that we find abhorrent in them. So if our mother's distant or cold, we disown cold and distant in us and can't see when we're also distant and cold, and it expresses in us unconsciously. Or we project it onto a partner. We either pull a partner in who's distant or cold, so we have another opportunity to heal the trauma, or we turn a good partner, distant and cold, with our hypervigilance. Because if I'm already expecting her to be distant and cold, and she sees the gates of my eyes closed, she will become distant and cold. That's the second way when we reject a parent. We have these unconscious occurrences. The third of rejecting a parent, I have these all, I like to work in numbers. The third piece of this is if we reject a parent, we also reject that part of us. In other words, if that parent is critical, we become inwardly critical. If the parent's aggressive, we become inwardly aggressive. If we were ignored, we ignore that fragmented young part in us. So the second theme, first theme, we've merged with a parent. Second theme, we've rejected a parent. Third theme, one of the largest, we have an early break in the bond with our mother. And Julie was talking a lot about this in her talk. If there's a break in the attachment, we weren't mirrored, an event happens, dad's drinking, mom's cheating, they're separating, there's an incubator, someone dies, some event happens in utero or in those first few years, and we often don't know about this, right? Because it's an enigma to us, because the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex haven't established, the connections to the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex don't develop until we're 2 or 3. So we often have no clue why we're like this. We just say, well, I'm just wired that way, that's just me. And yet, when we have a break in the bond, we can't trust the feeling of who we are. Where does the feeling of who we are come from? It comes from that looking. It comes from that seeing, that the mother mirroring. So we're often held together with tightness and anxiety, and maybe everything's fine until we go into a relationship and we have the feeling of don't come close, or stay away, or I need you, or withdraw, or or push away, or isolation, or don't leave, cling, all this stuff. But again, the effects are unconscious because we often don't know what happened. We have to go home and say, Mom, what happened? Or we have to piece together, if we don't know our mother or if our mother's passed away, from our trauma language. When we have this trauma language, we can tell what happened. It's in the body, it's in our words, it's in our face. The fourth theme, probably the sexiest theme, is when we have an identification with someone other than our parents, like the grandfather who hurt someone and we feel we don't deserve to live. Or the grandmother who lost a child, like the story I told earlier. She's identified with her grandmother and fearing that she'll hurt her child. Or the stillborn brother that nobody talks about because it was so painful for our mom, and we're given the same name. Mother's belief is he's come back. And because this child's excluded and we identified with this child, we start to live lifeless like this child, unseen like this child. We don't fit in, we don't belong like this child. These identifications are very peculiar and very interesting. These are the four themes.
Thank you. So these are some beautiful themes that we can maybe as a panel all go a little bit deeper on. It's very much about what we call developmental or early trauma or attachment trauma. So Scott, why don't we begin with you having a response to maybe what Mark's talking about?
It's funny how we all sort of come from different backgrounds, different education and experience. And yet I can hear in him through my own language how I'm working with trauma. I recognize, even though I'm not aware of your four, I recognize it in my own work at the Kiloby Center. The mirroring effect is very powerful. You talked about the mirroring in terms of parent mirroring to child, certain identities. That mirroring is going on in so many different ways. Vertically, horizontally. Vertically meaning your friends, your co-workers, your family, and then vertically, generationally. So we're mirroring all sorts of things, identities in each other all the time. And so when we work with trauma at the Kiloby Center, oftentimes at the root of it is what we call a deficiency story, which is kind of another way of saying of what he was saying, is where we internalize certain things about ourselves that are not ultimately true. Things like, I'm not worthy, I'm inadequate, I'm unloved, I'm abandoned, I'm weak, I'm powerless, or something like that. And what's so hard about treating trauma is that we do push a lot of this out of our consciousness. I noticed you sort of almost got to the word shadow. That's one way of pushing it out of our consciousness. We sort of we repress or disown certain things about ourselves. We push it out to other people, whether it's our spouse or. And so part of trauma work, I think, for me, is bringing everything back to the self. So if you've projected something out onto somebody else, which happens in a number of ways, not just with shadowing. Shadowing is like when you're repressing or disowning something about yourself. You don't see it in yourself, and then it shows up in somebody else. But there's other mirroring effects that just, I love the way that you explained when a certain look from somebody, that if I give off a certain look or I say certain things to somebody, I'm almost inviting them to treat me in accordance with the self-belief that I'm already holding. It's like the filter, and everything I'm trying to do, on an unconscious level, I'm validating or confirming that identity in myself by the way that I present myself in social situations. And there's a myriad of examples of that, right? Because human nature is so fluid and continuous. But that's constantly going on in relationship. And we are such precious and impressionable creatures. We learn so much and we take on so much and so many imprints about who we are that ultimately are not actually who we are. So that's both the tragedy and the blessing in all of this, because when we have to know who we think we are, who we've taken ourselves to be through this mirroring and this transgenerational trauma and just, well, trauma, PTSD. We have to learn who we've taken ourselves to be. What life, Julie was talking about how I'm paraphrasing, but how we often don't realize that it was our environment, it wasn't us, right? Mm-hmm. But yet, that's not how we experience it. We experience it that it's us, right? That it's me. And so coming back to the self, bringing everything back to the self for me is about illuminating these shadows, these projections, this very delicate mirroring that happens in relationship. Just like the look of a father. Have you had a father or mother that looks with you in a punishing way or a judgmental way? I mean, that itself can be very traumatizing. And that in of itself, those looks, those stares, those words, actually create an identity within us that he was speaking to it. So what's so beautiful about this work, trauma work, is that it goes into the very deepest and scariest aspects of our identities. That's what's scary to people. However, and another thing that Julie said, that's where the work happens. Because through seeing that these scripts are not who we are, there's a tremendous freedom. And I love the fact that Julie mentioned that it's becoming more and more somatic-based, the therapies these days, because at the Kiloby Center, it's almost all somatic-based, because we do hold so much here in the body. So, when we talk about trauma, it's almost like a depressing topic at first, because it's like, I don't know that I've met anybody that doesn't have some trauma.
Right.
Even if it's the trauma of being human, think you come out of the womb and you're in this body, and it's like, oh my God, and I have to survive now, and I have to find love, and I have to find all this stuff, and nobody's giving it to me, and I don't know what to do. So just the trauma of being human, if nothing else. So we all have this in common. It seems rather scary, but in a very ironic way, it is a gift when we become ready to welcome all these parts of ourselves back to the self and see ultimately that they're not who we are, and to allow them to dissolve and come back to our true nature, which is whatever you want to call that, our divine essence, awareness, presence. All of these things are such opportunities. That's what I got from both you and both of you speaking, and
Thank you.
There's a real richness there.
Thank you, Scott. Ajaya, can we hear from you?
Sure.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yes. Good. My background is largely in the somatic orientation, and I find that one of the most powerful ways to start to dissolve the binding in the body, the kind of psycho-spiritual binding, the felt sense of who I am that happens in the relational field that we're talking about, in the early developmental relational field. I think you were talking about how we get sort of cut off from ourselves. We get locked out when there's enough trauma. And my experience is that if you can start to bring people into, first, a safe space,
Right.
a resourcing space, but also orienting towards pleasure. If you can actually start to feel sensation that's pleasurable sensation, to let the awareness start to come back into the body. And my sense is that even if your early experiences, because what we do is we have to actually bond with the environment that we're born into to survive it. So that's where that felt sense of self comes in. So if someone was beating you, you're going to learn that that's what love feels like, and you're going to keep perpetuating that, which is what you're talking about.
Or that the world is not a safe place to be, at the very least.
Right.
Right, yeah.
I guess my experience tells me, working with people and with myself, that there's something deeper. There's something below the nervous system. There's a more intrinsic, innate connectiveness, belonging. What this event is very much about, pointing to the presence of our being, that's innately in our biology. And even if our family didn't do a great job, or our ancestry didn't do a great job mirroring that or affirming that or being able to attune to that, I still believe it's there. And that when I'm in a role with someone where I can actually play that role in a sense of kind of reparenting, people come alive, It's like that developmental need is still there. And even though it wasn't met at the time that it chronologically was online, it's still there.
That's a beautiful thing about healing trauma. We can give ourselves the experiences that we didn't get when we were children or babies. We can recreate them, and that will shift the body. It will shift the organ or the nervous system back into a deeper state of organization. But it can be really tricky to get there if we don't ever have that loving sense of mirroring. If we aren't looked at with love and compassion, if somebody doesn't see us, then to get to that innate part of us that you were speaking about so beautifully is really tricky, because it's as if we get these defenses that come up that are going to protect us from going anywhere near the trauma, the feelings of the trauma, and the emotions that go with it, because the emotions can be so intense. And at the time of the trauma, we have no capacity to be with it, otherwise we would have done, but especially in early trauma, right? So we disconnect, and there's so much dysregulation in the nervous system and all of the systems in the body that I think you're right as well. When we are in therapy, if we can be with somebody that can look at us, create a safe space, nurture us, right, then we can begin to come back to the body in an easier and gentle way. And it does need to be easy and gentle, no big cathartic, re-traumatizing experiences anymore. Thank you.
Just one other
Sure.
comment. That's why I find that touch contact and also sound, I work a lot with sound with people, because they're actually, it's bringing them in to their own vibration, into their own sensation. That's very internal. It's very much in the core. And what I've seen is that when people can actually touch into the core, so they're not out on the periphery, then that's where that innate terrain is. That's actually never broken. That's always intact, that's always whole.
Yeah.
But if you don't feel it and it's just a concept, then you can actually use it to further sort of shame yourself.
Yeah.
But sound and awareness and breath and any kind of practice that brings you into the core terrain is where I find that native habitat very alive and well, even in the most traumatized people.
Yeah. Sound is incredibly important, the sound of our voice. So a lot of therapists will know how to use the tone, or what we call a prosody of voice, to go up or down. That can create a calming event in somebody's nervous system. Now, if we're speaking to somebody in this high-pitched voice, it's not very, very healing. It can be more startling. So you're right, sound can really calm us and bring us back to a safer place. Richard, I know you have some things to say about this.
Well, it's lovely listening to everyone. It's striking a lot of pieces in me. And one of the things I think is important as we're talking about trauma, because as you were intimating, it's something we've all experienced. So how have you experienced trauma in your life? I was listening when you were talking before, and Mark, when you were talking a little while ago. We have a lot of basic needs as a human being: food, shelter, clothing, safety. But I think there are 4 other basic needs that you were starting to touch on, which is, and you were, to be seen, to be heard, to be connected, and a sense of belonging. And to one degree or another, I think all of us have experienced a loss in one of those aspects. And people who are experiencing tremendous trauma, probably in all 4. There's a sense of disconnection from self. There's a sense of disconnection of belonging to the world, because there's an overwhelm of information, whether it's done incrementally, as you were talking about earlier, or it's coming from trauma from accident, war, sexual abuse, or we're inheriting it. And so how have we rejected ourselves in one capacity or another? And recovering from trauma, for me, feels like it's recovering some aspect of ourself that has been relegated as the shadow into the unconscious. One of the things I might ask you, when you feel into it, how does this impact you? Because it's something I ask at eventually people I'm working with who are experiencing trauma. I'm willing to be seen. I'm willing to be heard. I'm willing to see myself. I'm willing to connect to myself. I'm willing for you to see me and hear me. Because rightly so, I think there's a moment, as you were talking, Mark, earlier, we need to be able to talk about it. What things in our own lives have we relegated to the unconscious, or to the inability to speak about it, or to be seen embodying it? In the sense then we're hiding these secrets that we might not even know, as you're talking about intergenerationally, that we've inherited through our genetic dispositions. And what you were talking about, it's a somatic-based experience we're having. So unless we can bring it out through some kind of intervention that addresses the body directly, we are not going to really fully unfold the trauma. So the work I do, and I know that you're doing, and we're all doing, is somatically based. Talk therapy isn't going to get us very far. And there was one other piece that got struck in my mind, and you and I were talking about earlier, which is, for me, the function of our self, of the ego self, is an appropriating mechanism. It's designed to identify with whatever is arising. So we wake up in the morning and hunger is arising, and the ego picks it up and says, I'm hungry. When trauma happens, whether it's inherited intergenerationally or through some act when we're young or through an active war accident or illness, the body is feeling something's not right, something's wrong. But the ego comes in, this structure, and says something's not right with me, something's wrong with me. And in fact, what I like to do with the people that I'm working with as soon as I can, within the first session if it's possible, is try to look at the difference between something's not right and something's wrong with me. And there's some exercises and protocols that I've developed in working with people. Last year, I was at the Martinez VA working with a group of veterans who were hospitalized. These are people in the hospital for 6, 8, 9, 18 months trying to recover from the traumatic brain injury or the depression or the post-traumatic stress. And I take them through a protocol which is trying to separate out this something's wrong with me and something's wrong. And I'm always amazed after the intervention when I ask, what is your experience? And many people will say, I feel like I just came home. I realize there's not something wrong with me. I'm not broken. But there is something wrong here, something that is broken that needs to be addressed. And I think it's important. Otherwise, we can lay tremendous stress in healing, but inadvertently, we're continuing to reward there's something wrong with you, or there's something wrong with me. And so we can get to a modicum of healing, but unless we're able to separate that out, that there is nothing wrong with you, there's never been anything wrong with you, and what is it about ourselves that can't be hurt, can't be harmed, has never been injured, and doesn't need healing? And as one vet said after understanding this about himself, he said, you're the first intervention that has been stressing what's right about me versus what is wrong about me. And I think that's a very important component in all healing modalities, but especially about trauma. When a person comes through trauma and really does feel disconnected from self, disconnected from the world, and something is wrong with me.
Yeah, I think that's really important to focus on what is feeling okay. For some people, there's nothing that actually feels right. Everything does sometimes just feel so terrible. But some place maybe where they do feel connected to nature or connected to their cat. Something positive or pleasant in their life, if it's very early trauma, to connect with that, to begin to create this sense of what we call, reorganization of the nervous system, because it is very much connected to the autonomic nervous system.
It is that sense that you were talking about resourcing, finding an inner resource somewhere that it's not in our imagination, we're not making it up, it's reconnecting to that place we all know, even if we've been through tremendous trauma.
But it can be really hard to find. It
Yeah.
can be really difficult to know that it lives inside of us if we've never had that mirroring that's allowed us to feel it within ourselves. So maybe we can move to, what do we do to begin to connect with that part of ourselves that can feel okay, that can feel fullness, that can be vibrant and alive and doesn't continue to perpetuate these traumatic experiences that are living in our unconscious. So why don't we start with you?
Do you want to address this in a therapeutic context or just individually?
Maybe in a way that you work with people.
Yeah.
To give us a taste of some possibilities that are out there, that we're not just going to go into therapy and start talking about trauma, that we know is re-traumatizing, that we actually can begin in a different way, in a different possibilities that can be done.
Yeah. I think one of the pieces, just to add to this, that we're growing this field, is that I think what we're all describing is a situation where someone's isolated. There's a sense of being isolated from themselves, from life, from God, from nature. So what I find a lot of the healing context is actually bringing this warmth of company, of love, of presence, and actually letting the person entrain with my heart, with my core, with my connection to nature, to my own body. So I find in a therapeutic context, so much of it has to do with my own cultivation, what I'm actually bringing into the room, so that their organism actually has a different experience to entrain with. And so I think a lot of it's about building trust and rapport. But again, this goes on a non-cognitive level. The biological organism intelligence in us feels this innately.
Yeah, the body is sensing it. No matter what we say, the body's sensing something different.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I find that for me, there's a genuine sincerity when I'm showing up, that I truly am there to be with that person and see them clearly and love them genuinely. It's not a romantic love. It's a true honoring. It's like a birthright love, where I'm there to actually see their intrinsic wholeness and health and well-being. And so because I'm tuning to that part of them, it's like it starts to light up. And again, it's affirming, it's bringing this kind of positive affirmation to that's already present in them. And if they can then start to make contact with that and feel that. So for me, it's a lot to do with, asking the right questions, engaging them as well with breath, with sound, with touch, maybe finding parts of the body where they can start to sense where there's constriction, where they're locked out, and we bring the warmth of our presence there together.
Beautiful.
And start to let it dissolve, open.
So the body, as we know, carries the trauma, that the trauma lives within the body. Mark, maybe you can speak a little bit to our languaging and how that can help us maybe connect to the body in some way. Because sometimes it's just such a painful place to be. And even that is underneath that conscious awareness. A lot of people don't even know they're disconnected from the body. Because it's not just about feeling sensations. I know some very disconnected people who can feel every sensation in the body. That's not a marker of connection to the body.
I think we're all saying something very similar, is that there's this place inside us that doesn't need healing. You were talking about that it's innate, and Richard talked about how this idea of rather than what's broken, what exists without disruption, and this idea, we can access this piece of ourselves. I believe at its root, trauma is a good thing. At its root, I always say that the very trauma we were born to heal contains the seed of our expansion. And that when we can go to, I had people in the room, for example, say that sentence, which would bring up a contraction or some tight feeling in the body. And if we don't shy away from that tight feeling, but we can hold it in our awareness with breath, with sensation, with maybe even a word like, I've got you, I'm here, I'll hold you with our hand, I'll hold you with our breath, and I'll breathe with you until you and I are integrated, or until you feel safe and held. Who's the I and the I? Maybe it's us, this witness, this adult, and at the same time, there's this either fragmentation that occurred when we were young, or we inherited. Comes many ways. But when we can move into this place, as we're all saying, with breath, awareness, some sentences, some sensation. I like the idea of touching the sensation. and then touching the sensation again with breath, and then touching that sensation again with awareness, we can feel what's deep to the trauma in the same place. Something core that you were talking about earlier that's always there.
Yeah. Just even as you were saying those words, those sentences, you were looking at me, and I could feel it. I could feel it in me. I could feel opening and warmth. I mean, the power of word and presence with people is extraordinary. It's extraordinarily powerful. So I'll change the question a little bit, because we're all on a similar theme, so let's mix it up a little bit for the questions. So in early trauma, oftentimes it's such a frightening thing that happens to us, or we perceive that happens to us. It's as if that child part of us disconnects or gets disconnected. One way of saying it is, our 6-year-old consciousness or our 2-year-old consciousness can disconnect. And we grow up into adulthood, but we're still seeing the world or viewing the world through this 2-year-old or this 6-year-old. And this is where, as adults, we get into tantrums with our partners or at work, or anger comes up, or unusual feelings that we don't quite understand. A lot of times when I'm working with people, I'll actually have an image of oftentimes a baby that will come out of nowhere, and they'll be incredibly surprised, and they bring this baby back into the heart center, and you can just see this beautiful softening and integration that's happening for them. So maybe you can speak to these split off aspects of us. Richard, why don't you go first?
Well, if you want, open your eyes, close your eyes, but remember a time when you're having a particular emotion or a particular belief that you've fallen prey to. When we disconnect from ourselves, we start to nourish different beliefs about ourselves. Something's wrong with me, or some emotion like anger is arising. When we're cut off, road rage, for instance, can be a symptom of trauma. But if we think of an emotion and then we imagine, and the imagination is so strong, as you're pointing to, imagine a door opening and that emotion walking in, or that belief walking in, something that I do all the time with the people I'm working with. Use their imagination and imagine a meadow, a door opening, and that emotion walking in. Who's holding it? How old are they? What's the image? And oftentimes it comes in as a child, and that child has been neglected, abandoned, not seen, not heard, because we pushed it into the unconscious. So there's an image within us that represents this rejected aspect of ourself that may have been originally rejected through the trauma or through the intergenerational aspect or through sexual abuse when we were young, or some other aspect. But now we may have spent the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years rejecting it, because every time it started to push into our awareness, we pushed it down. So oftentimes I find these images, these babies or these children, which we hold within ourselves as images, come in pissed off. That's a technical psychological term.
And babies and children get really pissed off.
And so my first movement, if one of these walks in with you, is how do they feel about being with you, and how do you feel about being with them? We first got to heal that first relationship. We're able to hang out with each other, and then we can begin to inquire into a number of questions, simple questions. What do you want? What do you need? But the most important aspect is, what's the action that you need me to take with respect to you that helps us heal on our way? And so it always, for me, comes down to what's the action that we need to do. Is there a letter we need to write? Somebody need to speak to? Speak out our voice, our willingness to be seen and heard in some way. Find someone to talk about the aspect that you're talking about. Come into relationship with someone who can mirror back a sense of warmth and loving kindness and presence, because often in trauma, it's not so much what we're having them do, but it's the relationship between ourselves and the person we're working with that brings in for the first time a sense of loving and loving kindness. So it's to me, it's very practical. It's imaginative, but ultimately, what are the actions that we're needing to take into the world so that inner child or that baby really does feel cared for, no longer neglected by us, but being cared for, and that we're taking actions where we can ultimately say to ourselves, I'm safe with myself, and that child can say, I'm safe with you, I'm safe with myself, and now we have a nice healing going on. And it's something you might ask yourself as you're listening to us. If you were to say to yourself, I am safe with myself, what are the ways in which we abandon, betray, neglect ourselves? That's in a way a moment of little pieces of trauma we continue to do to ourselves. And ultimately, I would like us all to be able to say, I'm safe with myself. Then we know the world out there isn't necessarily safe. We can get traumatized again, but at least I can meet myself. I can be safe with myself.
You did this lovely gesture when you were speaking to healing the child, and your hands went like that. And this is about integration. We want to integrate these pieces that get split off or disconnected or fragmented. So it very much is about integrating, so we can all come back and experience this sense of fullness or wholeness.
If I can't be with me, there is no way I can be with you. Until I can be with myself, then I can start being with you and the world. And trauma is a disconnection from self and a disconnection from world.
Yeah.
Can I just say one just quickly, because I think this is an important piece that some people get confused about when they're working. If we're talking about connection and connecting in this loving environment, but quite often showing up for somebody with compassion and love and eye contact can be really terrifying. So if you've had that experience where you find it terrifying to really connect with somebody's presence or eye contact, most therapists today, I think, understand that and have different ways to work with it. Like, we don't want to sit in this loving glare. It can actually be terrifying to people, that we have to allow people to know it's okay to look away. It's okay not to look at me. And that gives them a deeper sense of safety. So, Scott, thanks.
I was going to say, the best, I could speak for 2 hours on that question because it's such a rich question. The best I can say is to talk about my own story a little bit. Before 6th grade and after 6th grade are very different for me. Before 6th grade, I was an outgoing, loving kid. I was the kid on the block that invited all the other kids to play games, and I'd put on shows for them. And 6th grade changed everything, because it was about the time when I realized I was gay, or I was starting to understand that. And at the same time, my core group of male friends turned against me and bullied me for months, so badly that I stayed home from school for months, absolutely terrified of the world and feeling like my whole universe had crashed. Then there was that process of disconnecting from that kid who started to feel very deeply unlovable, but didn't have the consciousness to see how that was going to affect the next 20 years of my life. The next 20 years of my life, I went almost immediately into drug and alcohol addiction right after 6th grade. I actually started in 7th and 8th grade to numb out all of that stuff and hide it from my consciousness. Along with that, as I grew up and started to come out in my 20s, what I was doing is I was falling in love with heterosexual men who couldn't love me back. And so if the gay men came to me and expressed loving kindness and support, and it would be like, no, you don't understand. That's not me. So I'm going to go after this guy over here who's going to absolutely ignore me and not love me, and that will prove to me that I'm unlovable. I did that in my 20s over and over and over again, and had no consciousness of what was happening, had no sense of how that linked to the trauma of being bullied by my peers, my male peers who I needed love from. Also did not have any idea of how that linked up to my own addiction. I'll talk more about that in my 2 o'clock presentation here. I mean, I'll talk about the experiential work that I use to work through this, but because that's its own subject. But to let you know is that to come back to recognizing this part of me, which was a very big part that felt deeply unlovable and unlikable, until that was dealt with, bringing it back home and really examining it and resolving it, there was no way that I could love myself. There was no way that I could truly love somebody else. So when people would say to me back then, whether they were therapists, you just need to learn to love yourself, I'd be like, are you kidding me? You have no idea. It's not like that. I can't just flip that on, and I can't talk myself into that. I'm holding this whole thing in my whole body and mind, and I'm barely aware of it. So we got to go a different approach here. So the different approach was to bring this into my consciousness about who I really see myself to be, and do a little bit of archaeological digging to trace it back to this 6th grade moment, and bring that 6th grade moment or those moments of being bullied into my present consciousness. Look at the bullies very gently, by the way, one by one, because I can't look at it all, right? It's just too overwhelming, the whole movie. But to look at it piece by piece, the one picture of getting hit in the face, just that picture, or the picture of being called faggot or whatever, or whatever it was, take each one of those things one by one and deal with whatever's being felt in the body along with just that picture, and undo that, just that, and then undo the next, just that, until then I can only then, for me, could start to really recognize what part of me is untouched, what part of me is okay, because the fog of that had run my life. I mean, I was unlovable, and I'd lived it out, script, just to a T. So for me, I needed to work with the phenomena a little bit first before I could simply come back to that place that is already okay. Even though I had a taste of it in the beginning, when I started to do the work, I had a taste of that which is okay. The conditioning was just so powerful that I had to work with that a little bit to get to it. Yeah.
Thank you, Scott. I would like to talk a little bit about the immobility response that I spoke to in my talk. I spoke about a gentleman who'd been mugged, and he just went into sort of this floppy response and was really felt a lot of shame that he couldn't respond, that he couldn't fight, or he couldn't say anything. And what I didn't say when I was talking is we traced it back to something that happened to him when he was a child. He was sexually assaulted when he was a child, and of course then he had no power to be able to fight this person that was assaulting him. And so then he, at that young age, he went into that immobility response and completely disconnected from his body. So that laid down this default mechanism, we call it, in his brain. So when he came across an event that had some kind of similar taste or flavor to the original traumatizing event, he went into the same pattern of just disconnecting and freezing. So I think it's something that's really important to understand, because rape victims quite often shame themselves, both men and women, because they don't fight back. But the immobility response is non-volitional. We don't have a choice. It's what we're perceiving is underneath our conscious awareness.
Can I say something about that?
Yeah, please.
When the Twin Towers fell, some people, and you saw that at the Boston Marathon, just collapsed. That was their immediate response. There were some people who just started running, and they ran across the Brooklyn Bridge, and they said they just kept running literally for hours. Other people, and you saw that again at the Boston Marathon, just immediately pitched in and started helping. That was their immediate response. I think in our culture, and many cultures, we're conditioned to think that we should respond, and then if we don't, we'll take that personally, something's wrong with me. Whereas in all of us, if there was a catastrophic moment in this moment, we're all going to potentially have different responses. Some are going to collapse, some are going to freeze, some are going to fight, and some are going to flee. And it's, as you're saying, built into you, built into us. And it also may relate to prior experiences where we might have had trauma or abuse, and so that's re-triggered off in the moment. But to reclaim that moment, that there's not something inherently wrong that I had this response, but as you were saying, it's in the limbic system, it's built into our unconscious, and we don't have control over it. And so to have a quality of meeting it with kindness, and to recapture that sense of, I'm always doing the best I know how. I'm always doing the best I know how.
So also in that immobility response, it's almost like it is a preparatory death state. We're perceiving threat. We can't run away. We can't fight. So anytime there's fear and perceived inescapability, we will move into that immobility response. And then one of the tricky things about it is it will stay within us, and we can override the shutdown and move on with our lives. I worked with a lady who was in the 2004 tsunami, and so many years later she came in to see me. She burst out in a session, "Oh my God, I'm alive." Part of her thought she was dead or dying. A lot of people that I work with who had some form of abuse or frightening experience as children will have the same realization. "Oh, I'm alive." So it's as if part of them don't realize that they made it. That trauma is still living within them. And that's where our vibrancy and our aliveness gets shoved down and cut off from us. So that's another sort of incentive to look at our lives, to explore just maybe, what's going on, how do we feel, are we vibrant, are we alive, do we grasp on to our sense of self, and because if we do, things will locate and fixate in our body and create tensions and blockages. So once we begin to sort through these traumas and these underlying terrifying death states, then the body begins to release and open, and we begin to feel our life force and our energy. Mark, do you have anything to say about the immobility response and how you may work with it?
Mostly the people I work with are coming to me for trauma with the parents.
Yeah.
So the first thing I want to do is to deconstruct that sort of stuck place of this was personal.
Right.
And so if someone considers this idea that I'm going to heal my relationship with my mother, and all of a sudden they want to vomit or they want to tighten, or one of these responses comes up, either just a shutdown or a freeze or a throw up or whatever it is, it's not until we can start to just pull some of the pieces apart and get some expansion in there that any mother who was herself given away when she was a child, or had a sexual trauma when she was 4 and lost the support of her parents, or any child in your birth order that would have this mother would experience this behavior, until we can pick apart the idea that it's not personal. So I like to show what happened to our mother, what happened to our father, that set up their unloving, their cruelty, their drinking, their distance, their coldness. And when we can look behind the scenes, kind of step back, actually increase the aperture so we get a fuller view, we can see, oh yeah, how could she have been anything but critical? How could he have done anything but drink? And that lets us get out of that dyad a little bit, where it's personal, and then step back to where we can expand it even with healing sentences and healing images. Because these images and sentences we heal through these images. If we have an image of my mother's cruel and it stops there, well great. We don't get very far.
Right.
But if we can get to, of course she was cruel, then we can get to a place of, Mom, I know you would have given me more if more had come to you from Grandma. But because it didn't, I'll give it to me. And when I do that, I'll honor you and I'll honor Grandma, and I'm going to change this pattern in our family that's been going on for 4 generations. So sometimes just sentences get some expansion, or even I have people put pictures of a mom behind their pillow at night, and just to work with, first it's up here and then the next week they can bring it down a little bit and just say, Mom, when you were alive, we didn't do really well, but from over there, please meet me at night when my body's more free in my sleep, and help heal the break that broke between us, and teach me how to trust your love, or to let it in, or to receive because I don't receive really well. Things like that are really helpful.
Yeah. That's beautiful, because that's going to thaw those frozen states, and we can begin to see that. And again, I hear in your words, it says cultivation of compassion that's happening, where it goes beyond us, me having a trauma or something happened to me, but wow, there's this whole lineage or ancestry of people who've been traumatized. And I think one of the powerful things as well, when we turn inwards and decide to heal, it's incredibly empowering. It's incredibly empowering to know that we can even maybe end this right here. That it doesn't have to go on. And if we have children or loved ones, that it's really empowering to know that this stops with me. I'm not going to pass this on.
When we're stuck in that place of, I've been wronged, I've been victimized, it was personal, it's not a lot of movement.
Yeah, right, yeah. Thank you.
I'll just comment and say, I think of that process as really about individuating or differentiating yourself from the culture, from your ancestry, from your parents, and starting to actually know what you feel like and what's true for you and where your energy field exists and what it feels like to actually occupy it.
Yeah.
So I think of that as a really important kind of differentiating process, creating space that's really essential to being able to start to reclaim more of that destiny path. I think you were the one, that last sentence you spoke about, that we can allow our conditioning, we can allow our experiences, our traumas to actually become our medicine, our gifts, our compassion, and even the revelation of our destiny, really revealing our path as we are able to do that differentiating work and really kind of transmuting or alchemizing the poisons, the toxicities, and actually discovering what the gifts are in them. And really, I think it's about connecting to that deeper kind of soul purpose level of, on a deeper level, even taking responsibility for our creation.
Yeah, I love that. The idea of the gift in the wound or the gift in the trauma. Of course, we're not going to say that to somebody in the midst of it because it doesn't make any sense. And I think people find that out for themselves and go, oh gosh, wow, I never realized this would have brought so much aliveness or brilliance or vibrancy to my life. I would like to speak to anger a little bit because that's such a big emotion in trauma, that in the face of threat or traumatic event, a huge amount of energy comes up and a huge amount of emotion comes up that is quite often in the form of anger, if not rage. And it can be a really terrifying experience to touch into that rage because it is so big. And so we keep it, outside of our awareness. It's pushed down into the unconscious. It can live in the body and create all kinds of symptoms. So what do we, I know what I do with it, but what do maybe some of you do with this anger that a lot of people say, oh, we shouldn't be angry, or we project it onto other people. How do we begin to touch into this intense emotion that lives inside of us?
Well, I think everybody's different, right? I mean, you just said some people predominantly will express anger as a comfortable emotion, as a way to cope and express it socially. Other people will repress it, and at the very, that'll be the last thing they will show, right? And then there's a continuum in between there. For me, if you know the Enneagram, I'm a 9 on the Enneagram. Anybody know the Enneagram is a 9? Okay, we don't have anger, right? Okay? But yes, we do, though. We do. And what Julie's saying is that we repress it. And somewhere along the way, that's how I dealt with that emotion, by saying it doesn't exist. And by keeping the peace in the family, and probably with regard to the bullying, right? It was a way for me to just sort of go hide and keep the peace and not have to deal with the fact that underneath all the current, I was really pissed that my best friends made my life hell in 6th grade. Yeah. I was really mad. Could not touch that feeling, though. Didn't access that feeling fully until many, many years later, even after I'd done a lot of work. And that's been the real humbling thing about the work that I've done for myself, is that you get to these places where you have these deep states of consciousness or these openings, only to find out there's more stuff there that you had no idea was there. And it's humbling because you can't really say, now I'm enlightened. because it doesn't really work that way, because we're still very human. And at some point, you don't even care about that anymore. What you care about is being honest and true to your own experience. And for me, it was like all of a sudden, my dog falls in the swimming pool. I'm scared to death my dog is going to die, and then I get pissed at my husband for it. And then I hate this, that I'm angry. I can't stand this, and I'm shaking. But then, because after so many years of not even knowing that I had that kind of anger, right?
Yeah.
And then finally feeling it. But it took a while. And so, again, the richness, the opportunity in all this is, I think we become more and more vulnerable and more open to our feelings and thoughts and our states and experiences and other people through deep work. And for me, with anger, because I wasn't comfortable with it most of my life, when it started to come out, really it did feel traumatizing in a certain way. The anger itself was, to the best of my ability, was to love it and welcome it and just literally go lie down on a bed, almost as if there was a magnifying glass just burning it up because I was bringing it into my presence. Just can I just be angry without trying not to be? Because I'd spent my whole life trying not to be. So it was oh yes, I can freaking be angry now, but in a way that allows it to be. And one of the most healing things, I highly recommend it, to do that if you're someone who represses anger. That's my own experience with it. I've also worked with people who feel much more comfortable expressing it socially, and they may have to go to look to other repressed emotions, like they may not be comfortable with sadness because it may make them feel weak, or fear, they don't want to show fear for the same reason. That's why we're all so different. But with anger, that's my experience with it, personally.
We tend to either, unprocessed or unrecognized or disowned anger, we tend to either have it pointing towards us, we act it out inwardly, or we act it out outwardly out there.
Yeah.
But there's a third option, which is beginning to feel it and integrate it and to be present with it. Right? In anger, just cut off anger is our life force. We're cutting off our vibrancy. So as we begin to integrate it back into our system, again, we become more vibrant, we become more alive, we feel more empowered, and we're able to respond much better than an explosive reaction that might occasionally sneak out of us, or just have to really quieten down and repress ourselves.
Yeah, and that's really good. And just for the nines in the audience, which I feel a kinship with, so many of us grow up not speaking our minds and being able to express how we really feel in a situation. Once that anger starts to come to the surface and it's loved and welcomed, you can start to express yourself more. Yeah. And it's very, very empowering to be able to say, this is what I want, this is what I think. And even if you don't love me, this is what I think, And that's a really empowering thing. So there's a lot of richness in all of these explorations, and you can't really know it until you deal with it. You can't know the richness until you deal with it, but you can hear other people talk about it, like me, and that can encourage you to work with it.
Yeah. Richard, it would be nice to hear your thoughts on anger. I know you work with one population of abused women, and the tremendous amount of rage underneath that. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think several things. One is I think of everything as a messenger. So anger is a messenger. But oftentimes in this work, people come with the thought that they're trying to fix, change, overcome, or something's wrong. So there's a complexity of levels here I'm trying to address, and depending on who I'm working with, and it's always an individual, but one is, again, trying to come back to this aspect that there's not something wrong with you, but there's something not right here. So can we keep tapping this inner resource that there's something here about you that is always okay, unheard, unharmed, and there's something wrong. So that's one level I keep resourcing. The other is trying to develop an inner resource of safety, grounded ease, so that as any messenger like anger is arising, we're touching the anger and then going back to this resource of safety. And so we're learning how to become comfortable with the arising. Two populations, because you mentioned it, I'm working with survivors of human trafficking. And I've noticed a very different population here. One we work with in Nepal, These are women often who've come from intact villages, intact families, but for one reason or another, they found themselves trafficked. Are subsequently survivors, come back, and as they're healing, they come actually from an intact ground of family, and that's really important. And there's another population we're working with in San Francisco who came from very broken families. They didn't have an intact family. They didn't have a father or mother, or they suffered tremendous abuse very early on. They have a very difficult time dealing with these emotions because they're very repressed, or they're so powerful, they're overwhelming them. So a lot of times then we're trying to help establish an internal resource, a sense of empathy, a sense of an ability to not feel something's wrong with them, and build in a way or reparent an intact inner system so that they can then meet these overpowering, overwhelming feelings.
Yeah,
So it's really interesting to look at who's the person, where are they coming from, what are they dealing with, are they taking this personally, or can they realize this is an arising messenger? How do you cope with it? So it's a complexity of levels with any given person or population that we're working with, and we need to understand all these different levels.
Yeah, thank you. We're actually out of time. I wish we could all continue on. I'm sure we will. Yeah, thank you all so much for being here, and thank you all for being here.